Bada bing, bada boo.
If you want to live near the billionaires in Florida, you move to Palm Beach. The median home price there is $4 million. And most of these homes, they sit empty for 3 seasons out of the year. These are like the second, third, fourth, fifth family homes for the ultra wealthy. They're not even primary residences. So even from an early age in this type of area, it is utterly clear who's got it and who doesn't have it. They say that there's 2 types of high schoolers in Palm Beach. The ones that played with American Girl dolls and then the ones that played with Barbies. American Girl dolls, if you don't know, they look just like a regular doll. You would not even know that it's an American Girl doll. They're iconic for having big doll heads and a little bit more on the shorter leg side compared to Barbies. But they can easily cost upwards of $100 for a singular doll. A single doll.
Wow.
I don't even think it talks or anything. It's just a doll.
So it's a high-end doll.
Exactly. Barbies, you can find for less than $10. Nina went to a school where even Barbies, they were passed down. Most families at her school couldn't even afford more than one Barbie. Most of the students at Nina's school, they're on a discounted or free lunch program that's funded by the government, so they don't see that side of Palm Beach. They get a different side of Palm Beach. They don't have American Girl doll money. And 14-year-old Nina was one of the kids that didn't have it. I mean, at least for now. So her plans, she's going to stay out of drama in school. That's her number one goal. Work a part-time job, make money, graduate with good grades, go to college, work hard, live near the water. That's the ultimate plan. She doesn't even have to live next to the billionaires, maybe the millionaires. But sometimes when you avoid something too much, it comes and it finds you. Nina finds herself sitting in her principal's office with her hair all frizzy, her eyes are red, and the principal is screaming questions at her, and the girl next to her, who looks like she's in just as bad shape, if not worse, and the principal screaming, "What the hell are you guys thinking? We have strict rules against fighting. No physical violence is ever allowed on campus." Nina's looking at the girl next to her. She's rolling her eyes. And the 2 girls, they had fought over Nina's boyfriend. I mean, this has been going on for weeks now. They were starting rumors about each other, shit-talking, trying to flirt with the boyfriend in front of each other. And today was just kind of a particularly bad day. They bumped into each other in the hallway, called each other all sorts of names like whore, skank. One student in the hallway screamed, "Catfight!" and everybody started joining in. And now both the girls' parents are called to the school, and one of the girls has a bloody nose. Which, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a big deal. Things happen. It's high school. But the principal decides to go through both of their backpacks, and in Nina's wallet, they find $300. Nina goes to a school where most students are on a discounted lunch or free lunch program. Where did she get $300? This is not a high school near the water where kids are given that allowance for the weekend. This is a school with a C rating. So the principal straight up asks Nina, "Where did you get this money?" Nina doesn't respond. She keeps her head down. Nina was way too young to be stripping. That was clear. Besides, the $300, they were in crisp $20 bills, not crumpled up lotion-covered 1s or 5s. Drugs?
And she's 14?
14. Maybe it's drugs? Nina's parents are like, well, it's definitely not us. She didn't get it from us. We didn't give her $300. We don't have $300 to give. So Nina's parents get to the school and they keep begging her to just tell the truth. Where did you get this money? It's okay. Head coverage on this ongoing development of all the court docs coming out. Victims' names, identifying information, and dialogue have been all changed for privacy. Even if authorities or the general public believe something is a fact, for the reason that there are ongoing legal disputes, we will be saying allegedly. However, our intention is not to cast down on victims' testimonies. In fact, some victims have bravely given first-hand public accounts that can be found online if you would like to read the victims' testimonies from themselves. Any and all theories mentioned in this entire episode are purely my speculation, netizen speculation, and things gathered from the internet. Now, with that being said, I also would like to make it very clear that all the details of today's episode can be found online. We are not investigative journalists, and we have not gone directly to the victims or the sources. And if you ever feel in any episode that something was miscommunicated, misrepresented, or have any additional information you'd like us to know, please leave it down in the comments. With that being said, let's get started. The Metropolitan Correctional Center has a bit of a problem. I mean, the name sounds neutral almost, minus the correctional part, but the nickname for the building is Guantanamo of New York, federal prison located on the island of Manhattan. But that's not the problem. The bad marketing of being the Guantanamo of New York doesn't even faze them. They don't care. It was the plumbing that was the issue. There was always a toilet in this prison that's overflowing with urine and fecal matter, sometimes straight into the prisoner's cells. It was never cleaned up properly because no one wants to clean up a prisoner's cell like that. So the entire building is just stinky. It's infested with rats and cockroaches. It's dark, it's humid all the time, and the smell makes your eyes water. Prisoners would show up to court. Your Honor, a rat ate my paperwork. They weren't even lying. The attorneys would be like, no, really, there is a rat problem and the rats are eating our client's paperwork from that prison. And in the south wing of this correctional facility, the setup was 2 inmates per cell monitored every 30 minutes by 2 guards who do rounds. These inmates
This episode and others like it are brought to you by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. Get some cool perks and help support the show by becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. I also recently launched a new channel dedicated to the nuts and bolts of making a living as a creative. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, you can check it out at the link below.
There are 5 times in Earth's history where we had mass extinctions. By mass extinctions, I mean at least 75%, 3/4 of the known species disappearing from the face of the Earth. Now we're witnessing what a lot of people are calling the 6th mass extinction, where the same thing could happen on our watch. The data are rock solid. I don't think you'll find a scientist that will say we're not in an extinction crisis.
So, in this episode, we're going to talk about the 6th mass extinction, what's driving it, and what, if anything, can be done about it. The first thing we need to do when talking about mass extinction is to establish what exactly that means. It's a scary term. For most people, it conjures up images of the dinosaurs getting wiped out by an asteroid and the Earth being plunged into fire and darkness. Well, I've got good news and bad news for you. The good news is that mass extinction doesn't always mean apocalyptic, literally earth-shattering calamities. The scientific benchmark for mass extinction is 75% or more of existing species completely dying out in a relatively short period of time, geologically speaking, usually less than about 2.8 million years. Extinction is a normal part of life on Earth, so much so that we've defined what's called a background rate of extinction, which comes out to between 0.1 and 1 species per 10,000 per 100 years. Okay, that doesn't sound so bad. 2.8 million years is a long time, even if we're experiencing a mass extinction event. Well, here's the bad news. The event unfolding now is happening on a scale unprecedented since the extinction of the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. And it's happening incredibly quickly and continuing to accelerate. In 1991, 1 salmon species was endangered. Today, it's 14. Countless insect species are already gone for good. A WWF study says that in the past 50 years, the abundance of global wildlife has collapsed by 69%, with the worst effects being seen in Latin America, where abundance has fallen by 94% since 1970. According to a number of studies, the current rate of extinction is between 100 and 1,000 times higher than the pre-human background rate. And that should give you a clue as to what's driving this crisis. To anyone paying attention, it's pretty clear why we're experiencing a 6th mass extinction. It's easy to say that humans are a blight, or we've overpopulated the Earth, or some other vague condemnation of our species as a whole. But that's not the problem. There's plenty of room for all of us. There's plenty of food for all of us. The Earth isn't overburdened. And anyone who claims otherwise is either misguided or trying to sell you on some Malthusian worldview. The problem is that since the Industrial Revolution, the world's dominant economic system has been built on the core principles of extraction, accumulation, profit maximization, and endless growth. It stands to reason that if the profit motive is the sole determinant of the path society takes, any number of crimes against our environment can be waved off as necessary sacrifices. Take logging, for example. When managed sustainably, trees are a renewable resource. They just take time to grow. A common sense system would ensure that we don't chop down more trees than we can replace over a given period. But that, of course, doesn't take into account the fact that we could generate more money and produce more stuff if we do keep chopping the trees. The Amazon rainforest is one of the planet's most crucial carbon sinks. A carbon sink is something that absorbs more carbon from the atmosphere than it produces. These are incredibly valuable resources, and critical to sustaining most life on Earth. In recent decades, thanks to deforestation and human-caused climate change, the Amazon is nearing what's called a dieback loop. Since the rainforest creates and relies on its own rainfall, when trees are killed by logging or wildfire, it becomes harder to maintain that fragile equilibrium. At some point, the Amazon will begin to fail, and as it fails, more trees will die, and as they die, the process will accelerate. And eventually, what was once the most vibrant expanse of plant life on Earth will be dry, desolate savanna. That's a dieback loop. And we're actively shooting ourselves in the foot by carving up the lungs of the planet for the sake of greater capital accumulation. Now, the Amazon dying off is a big picture problem, but if we zoom in a little bit, we can see where the current extinctions come into play. Habitat destruction is a major cause of the eradication of animal life on Earth. Humans have taken over 70% of the planet's land, as well as 75% of its freshwater resources. If we were just making use of those resources and living sustainably within these ecosystems, it would be fine. But the problem is, we bulldoze them, or strip them bare, or poison the water supply with industrial waste, or put up walls that block key migration paths, or kill any animals larger than a house cat because they're seen as a danger to humans. But you might be thinking, so what? They're just animals, right? Yeah, it's sad that some cool animals are going extinct, but at the end of the day, they're just not that important. Let me introduce you to what's called a keystone species. This is a gray wolf. Back in the 1930s, these majestic creatures were killed off in Yellowstone National Park. For the next 70 years, the deer and elk populations in the park exploded, straining the area's carrying capacity. What's more, without the wolves as a threat, the elk didn't feel the need to move around as much, and decimated the local plant population with their incessant grazing. This in turn damaged the beaver population, which relied on willow to survive through the winter. This continued on down the food chain. With the removal of one species, the entire ecosystem began to collapse. In 1995, gray wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone, and what's happened since then has been nothing short of incredible. With the wolves back, elk had to be more mobile, moving around to avoid the predators. This allowed the local flora to recover, with once bare hillsides now covered with trees and shrubs. With the trees came the birds, songbirds and ravens and eagles. The willows recovered, which provided food for the beavers. The wolves also acted as food distributors, leaving carrion for countless species, such as ravens, crows, eagles, magpies, coyotes, foxes, and bears. They killed coyotes, which allowed rabbits, mice, badgers, and other smaller animals to recover. The mice and rabbits brought ever more birds of prey. Before the wolves came back, there was just one group of beavers left in the park. Today, there are 9 beaver colonies. But it didn't stop there, not even close. The beavers spread and built dams, which had multiple effects. They tamed the seasonal runoff, created pools that stored water to recharge the water table, and provided shaded areas for fish and aquatic ecosystems for otters and muskrats. But most incredibly of all, the behavior of the rivers themselves responded to the wolves. With the ecosystem stabilized and the trees growing back, there was less erosion of the banks. The rivers flowed straighter and narrower, more pools formed, and all of this in turn reinforced the strength of the new wildlife by providing habitats for the many diverse species of the park. All of this, down to the very geography of the park, was revitalized by the presence of one single species. That's why gray wolves and certain other animals are considered keystone species, because without them, entire ecosystems fall apart. Now think about what it means that we're on track to eradicate over 75% of animal species on Earth. How many of those will be keystone species? How many that we don't even know are keystone species yet? But maybe that's still not enough. Maybe you still feel like it doesn't really matter, that we're insulated from the collapse. It may be hard to hear, but we are very much a part of this biosphere. We don't get to exist outside and above the rest of life on Earth. We are entirely dependent on it for our survival. Let's consider another factor in the mass extinction: climate change. Beginning with the Industrial Revolution, humans have pumped ever more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, drastically accelerating the warming of the planet. Back in the 70s, Exxon, yes, that Exxon, the fossil fuel giant, conducted the world's first truly comprehensive study into the effects of climate change. Their results were shocking and surprisingly accurate. They determined that their activity, and that of the rest of the oil and gas industry, would directly contribute to unsafe levels of warming, which would have untold negative effects on life. In a just world, they would have revealed their findings. But as a capitalist firm, under a capitalist system, they followed the prime directive, the profit motive. And instead of revealing their findings, they buried them and launched the most comprehensive corporate propaganda campaign in modern history. The rest you've heard before. If we don't cap warming at 1.5 degrees, we're in for a bad time. It'll accelerate the dieback loop of the Amazon. The oceans will become increasingly uninhabitable. We'll face more frequent and devastating weather events, including droughts, hurricanes, wildfires, and monsoons. And entire regions of the planet will become too hot to safely sustain human populations. But what I really want to stress about this is how it will affect our food supply. Remember how I said we rely on the rest of the animals on the planet? Let's start with fish. Like the Amazon, the world's oceans are a crucial carbon sink. Since we began tracking it in the 1970s, oceans have absorbed 93% of the world's excess heat generated by greenhouse gas emissions. This has contributed to a rapidly warming aquatic environment. They've also become starkly more acidic and contain less oxygen. The ocean is home to somewhere between 500,000 and 10 million distinct species, a massive chunk of the planet's biodiversity, on a scale that would make Yellowstone blush. As of right now, the oceans are expected to warm by up to 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. That's a whole lot more than the 1.5 degrees where we'd already be having a bad time. So what does that look like? By 2050, the tropics will see a decrease of 40% in their seafood catch. Shrimp could lose 70% of their habitat to warming waters in the Gulf of Mexico. From 2014 to 2016, Pacific cod populations decreased by 70% in the Gulf of Alaska. Entire fishing communities are no longer able to sustain themselves by catching salmon. Fisheries have closed. Coastal towns have enacted strict fishing restrictions where once there was no need. And low-income countries that are heavily dependent on seafood are being disproportionately affected by the climate fallout that is mostly the fault of industrialized nations. And it's not just fish. Food crops are at risk as well. Everything from staples like maize and corn to luxuries like cocoa and coffee are also in the crosshairs. The Yellowstone example should demonstrate just how interconnected the planet's ecosystems are. Plants, animals, even the terrain itself relies on a fragile equilibrium to thrive. But don't take any of this from me. The world's scientists are in agreement. To quote a 2022 IPCC report, climate change will increasingly put pressure on food production and access, especially in vulnerable regions, undermining food security and nutrition. The capitalist tendencies of overproduction, waste, and hyperconsumerism are only making these problems worse. Consumption drives extraction. Extraction drives exploitation. Exploitation maintains poverty and suffering. The myth that capitalism will one day magically provide this wasteful, first-world quality of life for everyone is just that, a myth. And even if it did, the Earth couldn't sustain it. Studies on global consumption suggest that in order to maintain a hyper-consuming Western lifestyle for every person on the planet, we'd need the resources of 5 Earths. This is why people say we cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the planet itself will be fine. That's not going anywhere. It's our own survival and the existence of countless amazing and often critical species that we're putting at risk. The 5 past mass extinctions all happened well before humans came onto the scene. They were natural. A massive asteroid, for example, or increased volcanic activity. The extinction we face today is of our own making. We have the data, We know what's causing this, and we know what economic system relies on causing these problems of extraction, overconsumption, and endless growth. If we want to stop the dying, the destruction of life as it has existed for the last 60 million years, we must dismantle capitalism. Even the scientists who are so afraid to say that capitalism is the problem recognize that this system cannot and will not solve the problems it creates.
I know there's no political will to do any of the things that I'm concerned with, which is exactly why I and the vast majority of my colleagues think we've had it, that the next few decades will be the end of the kind of civilization we're used to.
Throughout history, massive systemic change has always seemed impossible until suddenly it wasn't. As Ursula Le Guin said, "We live under capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings." Socialist revolution remains the only way to build a world that is sustainable and just. A world that doesn't rely on the destruction of the only home our species has ever had. We've known this for over a century, and the capitalist powers have crushed that possibility every time. Through coups, invasions, sabotage, assassinations, whatever it takes to keep the average person from realizing that there is a better alternative. I remember when I was a kid on a warm night, my family would all go outside and we'd try to catch fireflies. It was one of the most magical things to see, all these tiny twinkling lights floating all around you. And you'd catch one and you'd look at it and you'd think, wow, how does something like this exist? A couple decades later, and I have a 1-year-old daughter. She's going to grow up without ever seeing a sight like that. It's the little things like this that make you stop and think. The clock is ticking. It's socialism or extinction. Which side are you on? Hey there. I mentioned at the beginning of the episode that I recently launched a new channel. It's hard to believe, but for the past 10 years now, I've made my living as a creative professional. Over that time, I've picked up a lot of useful tips and tricks, and now I'd like to share them with the next generation of creators. This new channel is dedicated not only to teaching others how to make a career out of working creatively, but also to sharing some general musings on living a creative life. I'm really excited for this project, and I hope I can make a difference to anyone out there who wants to do what I do but doesn't know where to start. So if you're interested in YouTube or podcast or documentary work, or just want a little peek behind the scenes, consider subscribing. I've got 3 videos out already, and the 4th episode is coming next Friday. I'm going to stagger the releases of Second Thought and this new channel so that you've always got something to watch Friday mornings at 9 a.m. Central Time. As always, thanks for watching, drop a thumbs up if you liked the episode, thumbs down if you hated it, and I'll see you in the next one.
A disturbing analysis on homelessness.
Shocking rise in homelessness.
Oregon has the 2nd highest rate of unsheltered homelessness nationwide.
The problem has worsened, and the number of people experiencing homelessness has grown year over year.
The United States is supposedly a wealthy country. Despite this wealth, it has generally failed to deliver to the masses the freedom and pursuit of happiness promised in its founding scriptures. But isn't the US the richest country on Earth? Can a nation truly be considered rich when hundreds of thousands of its own citizens are sleeping on the street? In this video, we'll analyze the housing crisis in the US, what's causing it, why it's getting worse, and how it's driving Americans into poverty. If you enjoy what we do, then don't forget to like the video, and check out our Patreon for exclusive content and early releases. Okay, obviously, the US didn't invent homelessness or property. They've been around more or less since the dawn of civilization. But in more modern times, owning property has granted immense power. Take the early United States, for example. Owning property was so valued and so tied to morality that being homeless was illegal. Now, if you go looking for a law that compels homeownership or explicitly says being homeless is illegal, you won't find one. Since the 16th century, being unhoused has been criminalized under the euphemism vagrancy. In a 2019 paper, Risa Goluboff, professor of history and law at the University of Virginia, discusses the history of vagrancy laws and describes them as, quote, generally making it a crime to be poor, idle, dissolute, immoral, drunk, lewd, or suspicious. Goluboff bluntly and concisely explains the purpose of these laws, saying, quote, they served as a ubiquitous tool for maintaining hierarchy and order in American society. Since this hierarchy and order in the United States is dictated by liberalism and capitalism, these laws ultimately benefit the rich and the ruling class. Industrialization accelerated in the 1820s and 1830s, causing a mass migration from the farms to the cities. People began to work for wages instead of farming or working a trade, and therefore became entirely dependent on the capitalist aristocracy. President and unapologetic war criminal Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, marking the first federal legislation that directly caused mass homelessness. By the 1850s, police stations served as a makeshift, often violent and inhumane shelter system. You might be surprised to learn that until the 1870s, the term homelessness didn't exist. It was coined during a tumultuous time in the United States. The slaves, freed without any support or compensation, were being subjected to the early prison industrial complex. The National Railroad system was being constructed, and the nation was suffering the worst economic depression in US history. In fact, this period was called the Great Depression prior to the one we think of today, and there's ongoing debate about which was worse. This prequel Great Depression was responsible for 20% of the total US population losing their homes. If that were to happen today, 66.8 million people would be unhoused. That's roughly the total population of California and Texas. The Great Depression of the 1930s and natural disasters like the Dust Bowl led to the next major explosion in the unhoused population. Liberals tend to give too much credit to the New Deal under the Roosevelt regime. However, many, if not all, of the programs facilitated systemic racism, which severely held back the success of the legislation. For now, we'll focus on the National Housing Act, which created the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA. Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law, says the FHA is a state-sponsored system of discrimination that was primarily designed to provide housing to white, middle-class, and lower-middle-class families. The US government created and incentivized the system known as redlining, which the Texas Homeless Network correctly observes paved the way for African Americans' overrepresentation in homeless populations today. These programs created vast wealth, mostly for white families, through the 60s. Unfortunately, housing discrimination wouldn't become illegal, on paper and weakly enforced, until 1968 with the Fair Housing Act. The 1950s also bore witness to one of the most cruel and overlooked policy decisions in US history: deinstitutionalization, or moving from centralized and often isolated mental health care institutions to a community-based model. Due to the incentives created in the US for-profit healthcare system, an ignorant medical establishment, and a bigoted public, thousands of patients ended up unhoused and without resources. The process of deinstitutionalization was painfully slow, lasting until the 1970s. Despite these challenges, a movement against the vagrancy regime scored a major victory when in 1972 the Supreme Court ruled in the case of Papa Christou versus City of Jacksonville, in which 8 defendants were convicted in Florida for violating a Jacksonville vagrancy ordinance. Justice Douglas stated in the judgment that the ordinance was void for vagueness, because it fails to give a person of ordinary intelligence fair notice that his contemplated conduct is forbidden by the statute, it encourages arbitrary and erratic arrests and convictions, it makes criminal activities that are normally innocent, and it places almost unfettered discretion in the hands of the police. Much of the more modern epidemic of homelessness started in the late 70s and early 80s. The Reagan administration infamously ignored the largest public health crisis in living memory, the HIV and AIDS pandemic. As a result of the lack of federal support, many suffering from HIV and AIDS became homeless before succumbing to the disease. The 1970s and 80s saw a flood of neoliberal policies that shaped the modern homelessness epidemic we experience today. Now, we can't talk about homelessness without mentioning the war on drugs, started by Richard Nixon and carried forward by every US president since. John Ehrlichman, assistant to the president for domestic affairs under Nixon, did not mince words when he later confessed, "The Nixon White House had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. This war on the left and people of color led to unprecedented and ruthless incarceration in conditions more akin to concentration camps than institutions of reform. According to a 2018 study, the unemployment rate among people who were formerly incarcerated is 27%. This is higher than the total unemployment rate during any period in US history, including the Great Depression. Due to the difficulty in finding work, formerly incarcerated people often become or underhoused and are forced by their material conditions into antisocial behavior for survival. The recidivism rate in the United States is one of the highest in the world, a staggering 76.6%. Clearly, if just one conviction can make it incredibly hard to find work and thus proper shelter, then multiple convictions make it all but impossible. This condemns people to an undignified and traumatic life. By now, based on countless studies and plain common sense, it should be obvious that the solution to most antisocial behavior is to ensure basic human needs are met. Nutritious food, clean water,